Good evening, friends. I'm Pat Mannon, and I'm joined tonight by Brother Ben Soto, and we're coming to you live from Northwest Arkansas. As always, we are so delighted to be with you and so glad that you're with us. We are studying the book of Daniel. This is the 16th part in this series of studies on that book. And we're in the 11th chapter, and there are 12 chapters in the book. So we're very near the end of this study. In fact, there will only be one or two or no more than 3 lessons from tonight. And so our study will soon end. Many of you have been with us all the way, and for that we're very grateful and very thankful for your interest. We've said a lot of things that are very difficult to retain, and Ben and I understand that. The last 2 or 3 studies, this chapter 11 has been extremely difficult for a lot of people. I know it is. It's difficult for me to teach it. And so I'm going to give just a minor review tonight of some things that chapter 11 deals with. And then we'll take up at the place where we stopped last week, and we'll continue our study. What I hope to do tonight is to give you a refresher, a summary of those things the last 2 or 3 weeks that we've dealt with in chapter 11 in this vision. And in doing that, I hope to bring clarification to it for you, because we've given you so many names of kings and rulers, of battles that were fought, of certain dates when things occurred, intervening nations in the politics and wars of other countries. We've given you so much information, and I realized when I did it that you cannot retain so much information. No one can. And so what I hope to do is to review in such a way that this will bring a refresher to you, perhaps a better understanding of it as we finish out the book. I'm not interested in leaving people behind because the details are so difficult to understand. I'm interested in everybody coming along with us and gaining things from the study. And so that'll be the purpose of my opening remarks tonight. The chart that you see in front of you, I want to take you back to it. It's from chapter 8. When we studied chapter 8, I remember telling you that you should be aware of this he-goat and these 4 horns that came up and the little horn that came out of one of them, because he would appear again in chapter 11 later in the book. So let me review here, even though I've done it several times, the contents some here of chapter 8. And then I want to switch from there to chapter 10 and 11 and bring us up to date on where we will begin tonight. Remember, back in chapter 8, Daniel had a vision, and he saw a ram, a 2-horned ram, standing by the river. And this ram, we noted, was Medo-Persia. The 2 horns were the rulers of the empire, the Medes and the Persians. One horn was higher than the other one, and it came up last, and that was Persia, because they were always the ruling dominant element in the empire. In fact, it became known not as the Median Empire or even so much Medo-Persia. It was really the Persian Empire, because Persia was so dominant. And that's the reason one horn on the ram was raised higher than the other one. Then Daniel looked in the vision, and he saw a he-goat, a male goat, coming from the west, coming so fast that his feet weren't even touching the ground, just flying. He had between his eyes a very notable horn, and he ran into that ram with all of his fury. And the ram was helpless, and he stomped him and just kept stomping, and nobody could deliver the ram out of his hand. He just crushed him. The he-goat from the west, this male goat, is the kingdom of Greece, the Grecian Empire. And what Daniel's seeing in this vision is Greece conquering the Medes and Persians. That notable horn that was between the eyes is the first king, we're told. That's Alexander the Great. As we read the vision then, we were told that this horn, this notable horn, one day in the height of his power, the horn was broken. This is the death of Alexander the Great. But in the place of that broken horn, there came up 4 other horns. And down here in the bottom right, you'll see a picture of this goat now with 4 horns that are come up. These represent 4 different divisions of the Grecian Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. We have Thrace that was ruled by one of Alexander's generals named Lysimachus. We have Macedonia, which was ruled by another general. His name was Cassander. We have Syria, which was ruled by another one of his generals, and he was Seleucus I. He ruled Syria. Then we have Egypt, which was ruled by another general. His name was Ptolemy I. So you have Thrace, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt, represented in these four horns, ruled by the four different generals who divided up Alexander's the Great's kingdom. Now, normally, when a king died, he passed the rule of his empire on to his sons, on to his posterity. But in the case of Alexander the Great, he didn't have a posterity to pass it to. It never went to his posterity. Instead, it was just taken over by four of his generals, and they divided it up. And if I can show you on a map the divisions. Up in here is Thrace, that we said was ruled by Lysimachus. Over here's the Macedonian part, and that was taken by Cassander. Right through here is the Seleucid, or the Syrian part, that extended all the way to Egypt from Asia Minor, and was ruled by Seleucus I. It gets its name Seleucid Empire because it was ruled by the Seleucids. Then down here is the south part of it. This is Egypt, ruled by the Ptolemies, Ptolemy I Soter. And so he ruled Egypt down here. So you have Syria up here to the north, the Seleucids. You have the Ptolemies, Egypt down here to the south, and lying in between, Palestine, the Promised Land, Jerusalem, land of the Jews. Israel lay right in between Syria and Egypt. In chapter 11 now, the Syrians up here, the Seleucid part of this empire, is referred to as the king of the north, but it has multiple kings. And a history is given us through the years of different rulers that ruled the north. Every one of them is referred to as the king of the north. It's up to us to know the history of which one ruled at a certain time. And then down in the south, the kings that ruled the Egyptian empire is called the king of the south. And of course, there were multiple kings that ruled Egypt. They are all referred to as the king of the south in their given day and time. And there's a strife between the king of the north, the Syrians, the Seleucids, and the king of the south, the Ptolemies, the Egyptians. And lying right in between is Palestine and the Jews and Jerusalem. And so, you see, the Jews are they're like a ping pong ball here. They're lying in between two powers that are fighting each other, that are in conflict with each other. And this results in, at times, the Jews being governed by those down in Egypt, by the king of the south, and at times ruled by the Syrians or the Seleucids up here to the north, or ruled by the king of the north. And in chapter 11, there is a continuous history. And what Daniel's being given in his vision is a history of his people and his holy city, Jerusalem, and what will happen to it in the coming future, especially in the time when the Grecian Empire ruled, and even after the death of Alexander the Great, when Greece continued in a divided state among his four generals. That's really what the vision is all about. Daniel's being told about the fate of his people, the Jews. It does not refer to anything in our day and age, as some people want to make it. There is no future Antichrist here in chapter 11. There is no modern day Russian conflict with Egypt or with Israel or any such thing. No alliances like this at all. None of that is modern day history. Daniel's being shown what's going to be really coming to pass just a few hundred years into the future, when Greece becomes a world power. Greece was not even a world power when Daniel got this vision. And so we have to be aware of the setting in which this vision occurs and apply it in its proper place. We don't want to have a theory and go to the Bible and try to take things out of chapter 11 and prove some Antichrist theory. some great tribulation in the future that we've conjured up in our own dreams. But we need to come to the text itself and see what the text teaches, and that's what we'll do. And that's what I've been doing with you. Now let me take you back to chapter 10. In chapter 10, and by the way, chapter 10, 11, and 12 are all this one vision. In chapter 10, Daniel gets this vision, and it troubles him so badly because he sees bits and pieces of it. He's got some understanding, and he can see that his people are in for a great amount of suffering and death and persecution in the future. And he is grieved over this, and he begins to pray. And when he begins to pray, God sends the angel Gabriel. When he first starts praying, God instantly hears and answers. And he sends Gabriel, the archangel, to make known to Daniel what this dream is all about and to give him complete interpretation of it. But on the way to Daniel, Gabriel is sidetracked. He gets into a conflict with demonic forces over the rise of Persia and Media's empires. And so he has to stop and do battle with what's called the Prince of Persia, this demonic being that is fighting for Satan behind the scenes, unseen to human eyes, but known to the eyes of heaven, of course. And that delays Gabriel 3 weeks, 21 days. Finally, Michael the archangel comes, and he battles with this Prince of Persia, releasing Gabriel on his mission to go to Daniel and finally reveal to him the contents and meaning of what he's seen. That's chapter 11. Now chapter 10 is the setup where we learn about Gabriel, and we learn about Daniel's troubled nature over this, and the comfort that Gabriel brings him. And then in chapter 11, as we've been studying, he begins to tell him about the vision Daniel's seen, and he tells him what all it means. Now remember, the vision's going to cover this conflict after the death of Alexander the Great. It's going to basically cover a conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the king of the north and the king of the south, with Israel lying in between, and they are affected by the conflict that's going on north of them and south of them between these two nations. And it's not good news for Daniel's people, for the holy city of Jerusalem, not at all. This is what is revealed now in the contents of the vision. Now remember, I showed you the ruling line of the Seleucids up here in the north, up here in Syria. And I showed you Seleucus I and how he had a son named Antiochus I. We talked about his children and their marriages. He had a son, Antiochus II Theos, and of course he had 2 different wives. We had a son out of them, Seleucus II Callinicos, and he fathered 2 sons, Seleucus III Coranos, and of course Antiochus III the Great. Antiochus III the Great fathered this villain that we run across in chapter 11, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And on this lineage comes on down. And this has been the confusing part, I know, for you in chapter 11, trying to keep up with all these names, because you can put the same kind of family tree down here in Egypt and show the Ptolemaic line, starting with Ptolemy I Soter and all of his different offsprings, and they come into play too. And so we've had names of these kings that rule north and south and their interaction with each other. We've seen marriages try to form where one king will give a daughter to the other king, trying to bring about peace or gain control or political favor. And we've had to keep up with those names. It's just impossible, isn't it? So what I'm going to do tonight, we have covered the first 35 verses of this vision. Daniel 11, Daniel 11 verses 1 to 35. The best way that I know to teach on this is to give us a paraphrase what's going on. And I'm going to leave this king of the north, king of the south map down here. In fact, I think this one may be clearer. less markings on it, and I'll use it. We may or may not refer to it later. If we do, I'll have it here in front of us. What I want to do, since we've covered the first 35 verses, friends, I want to go back and I'm going to sum up in what I call a paraphrase the contents of each one of these 35 verses. I will interpret it with a paraphrase of what that verse is saying, in other words. And I'm going to give this to you continuously through the 35 verses that we've covered. I am doing this to show you once again how all of this fits. The names of all these rulers, some in the north, some in the south, and we'll mention them again, and some of the battles that they fought, and some of the things that happened. And I'll take you back through a paraphrase, a summary of the 35 verses we've covered. After that, we need to continue on in our study, and we will do that, Lord willing, tonight. So, excuse me, with those remarks now, let's go back, and what I will do is I'll read like verse 1, and I'm going to read you the paraphrase over on the right. If you have a device on which you're viewing this to where you can expand this font, some of you put this on a large screen television, you're able to read this with me. These are just my notes, my remarks, my paraphrase, as well as the verse out of the King James Version. So I will read verse 1, then the paraphrase, verse 2, and the paraphrase, verse 3, the paraphrase, and so on, all the way through the first 35 verses. Bear with me now, this is history. And one reason the book of Daniel is in such dispute by skeptics and atheists and such people as this is it is such an accurate history of the future from the time of Daniel onward, that there are just men that are skeptical about it, that think this had to be written after all these things happened. After all, who could know all of this in advance? Their problem is they leave God out of the equation. God knows the future. And this future was revealed to Daniel in this vision. So Daniel's getting history in advance. That's really what chapters 11 and 12 are. A history of the Jews. Not very long after the death of Daniel, probably within a couple of hundred years, all of this starts unfolding, especially the Grecian part of it. And so here now is the verse and each paraphrase on each verse. Verse 1, Daniel 11. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. In the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede, I, the messenger, stood to confirm and strengthen him. Either he stood to confirm and strengthen Michael, whom he's talked about, or Daniel, likely Daniel. Verse 2, and now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. See, Persia was under rule then from Cyrus, Darius and then Cyrus. There'll stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. Here's the paraphrase, after the reign of Cyrus the Persian, there will be 3 more Persian kings. 1, Cambyses, 2, Pseudo-Smyrtus, 3, Darius the First. The 4th, who is Xerxes, he is Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, if you're familiar with Esther. Xerxes shall be richer than the others. He will use his wealth to stir up a multitude against the Grecians. And if you're familiar with Persian history, you know that Xerxes, also Ahasuerus from Esther, Esther's husband in essence, was so wealthy that he put together a very large army with which he attacked Greece. In fact, that army was over 5,250,000. He had ships, horsemen, soldiers, all kinds of military personnel and equipment and such things with which he attacked Greece, and he was defeated by the Grecians. The problem is, folks, the Grecians never forgot this attack by the Persians. And under Alexander the Great, they exacted their their revenge on Persia. And Alexander conquered the Medes and Persians, who had, under Xerxes, who had attacked Greece years before. And so keep that in mind. Now, verse 3. We're told, and a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Paraphrase, a mighty king, Alexander the Great, will rise to power and have great dominion. He will have many great military victories and do as he wants. And so this is the notable horn between the eyes on that goat. This first king, Alexander the Great. Here's his rise. Friends, listen. When Alexander the Great came into Judea, and he came into Judea around 332 to 333 BC, the Jews showed him these prophecies out of Daniel. They showed him this he-goat and the ram. They likely showed him chapter 11, and they pointed out that he would be the one that would conquer the Medes and Persians. And they showed him this prophecy. That's very interesting. That literally happened in history. You see, Daniel was already written. It wasn't something written after all of this happened. It was written before. This prophecy was shown to Alexander the Great himself. I wonder how he reacted. I do not know. But I think that would be very interesting. But anyway, he's predicted here in verse 3. He's this mighty king. Verse 4. When he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others besides those. Paraphrase. At the height of his power he will lose his kingdom. This is Alexander the Great. And it shall be divided not among his offspring, but among four of his generals, Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus I, Nicator, and Ptolemy I, Soter. Their dominion, however, will not be as great as that of Alexander the Great. They will eventually lose his kingdom to others. Back in verse 5 now. And the king of the south, remember this is Egypt, the Ptolemies, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Paraphrase, and the king of Egypt, Ptolemy I, Soter, shall be strong, and so will one of his generals, Seleucus I, Nicator, who fled for refuge to Ptolemy I, Soter in 316 BC. But he, Ptolemy I, Soter, will be stronger than him, Seleucus I, Nicator, and he will have a greater dominion. Verse 6. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengtheneth her in these times. Now see, that's very confusing. Here's the paraphrase. After fighting for a time, they, this is the king of the north, king of the south, this is Syria and Egypt, they will seek to have peace through the marriage of Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, to the Seleucid king Antiochus II, Theos. But the marriage will not bring the intended results. Instead, Laodice, the first wife of Antiochus II, there in Syria, will poison him, 246 BC. And her supporters will also murder Bernice, that's the daughter of the Egyptian king, and the child which she bore by Antiochus II. So this daughter of the Egyptian king is given in marriage to the king of the north, to the Syrian king. But it doesn't work because in order to marry this Egyptian king's daughter, up here in the north, the king of the north had to put away his wife, Laodice. And he put her away, divorced her. They had a child together. But he married this Egyptian princess. And they had a child together, but it didn't last because his ex-wife up here in the north killed him. And also killed his Egyptian wife and killed the son that they had together. So they were all wiped out, you see. Now that's going to stir up the Egyptians, you see. That's going to make them angry. Because the king of the south gives his daughter in a good gesture. She winds up dead, and so does his grandchild, this son that they had together up there in the north. They're all killed, and this is going to cause really great conflict. Here's the paraphrase again. After fighting for a time, they will seek to have peace through the marriage of Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, to the Seleucid king Antiochus II Theos. But the marriage will not bring the intended results. Instead, Laodice, the first wife of Antiochus II, will poison him in 246 BC. And her supporters will also murder Bernice, that's the Egyptian princess, and the child which she bore by Antiochus II. Now verse 7. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them and shall prevail. Paraphrase, but a descendant out of her roots, her brother Ptolemy III, Euergetes I, will gain power in Egypt and attack the Seleucid king, Seleucus II Callinicos, the son of Laodice and Antiochus II, and will be very successful and prevail in battle. In other words, the brother of this prince, this Egyptian prince that was given in marriage to the king of the north, that brother now is mad because his sister and his nephew, the little child that was fathered by the king of the north, they've all been killed now, and that's got Egypt angered, and so finally her brother decides to get revenge one day, and he does. He does. Verse 8, he comes against Syria. Verse 8, and shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Paraphrase. So the king of the south, Ptolemy III Euergetes I, will return to Egypt with many captives and great riches. He will also prosper and reign much longer than the king of the north, Seleucus II Callinicos. Verse 9. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. Paraphrase. So after the king of the south, Ptolemy III Euergetes I, attacks the king of the north, Seleucus II Callinicos, he will return to Egypt. Verse 10. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Paraphrase. The sons of Seleucus II Callinicos, who are Seleucus III and Antiochus III, will be angry. You see, their father's been killed. One of them, Antiochus III the Great, will assemble a great army and attack the king of the south, and will have various degrees of success against Egypt. There's that trouble now still brewing between Egypt and Syria. Verse 11. I hope this paraphrase is helping you. Verse 11, here's the text in the King James. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. The paraphrase now. And the king of the south, the Egyptian king Ptolemy IV Philopator, will fight against him, Antiochus III the Great, at the battle of Raphia in 217 BC, and be victorious. Although Antiochus III has a vast army, his great multitude will be defeated by the king of the south, Ptolemy IV. Verse 12. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Paraphrase. When the king of Egypt, Ptolemy IV, defeats this great multitude, he will be lifted up with pride, but he will not be made stronger by his victory. Verse 13. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army, and with much riches. Paraphrase. For the king of the north, Antiochus III, the Great, will increase the size of his army and strengthen his forces, and after a few years he will again attack the territories that are controlled by the Egyptians. So in other words, the king of the north, Syria, is coming again against Egypt, this time with a greater army. Verse 14. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Verse 14, paraphrase. In those days when Antiochus III attacks, many ungodly Jews will join with him in the victory against Egypt. But it will eventually allow Antiochus IV Epiphanes to persecute the Jews. Verse 15. So the king of the north shall come, and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Paraphrase, around 200 BC, the king of the north, Antiochus III, conquers Gaza and defeats the Ptolemy general Scopas at the Battle of Panion. Neither the Jews nor the king of the south, Ptolemy V Epiphanes, had the strength to resist. Verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Verse 16, paraphrase. With this victory, the king of the north, Antiochus III, gained full control of both Syria and Palestine as far as the frontier of Egypt. He took control of Jerusalem and eventually brought death and destruction upon the Jewish nation. Verse 17. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. 17, paraphrase. Antiochus III sought to strengthen his hold upon Egypt by giving his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V Epiphanes, thus corrupting her by using her as a pawn in his political schemes. The plan did not work, for after Cleopatra married Ptolemy V, she did not remain loyal to her father. So you got the king of the north giving his daughter to the king of the south, thinking that she's going to be loyal to him when she becomes queen of Egypt. But when she marries the king of Egypt, she's no longer loyal to her father up here in the north. She's loyal to the Egyptians. The plan didn't work, see. That's just going to create more problems. Verse 18. After this he shall turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered him, or offered by him, to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. Verse 18, paraphrase now. After this, Antiochus III will seek to increase his kingdom by attacking the coast of Greece and Asia Minor. But the Romans defeat him soundly at Thermopylae in 191 BC, and again in Magnesia in 190 BC. The greed of Antiochus turned against him. He was forced to accept Roman conditions. Now listen, and he was forced to accept Roman conditions of peace at the Treaty of Apamea in 188. Among the many conditions in the treaty, a great tax of 15,000 talents over a period of 12 years must be paid to Rome. Friends, this was a tax, a penalty that had never been heard of in the ancient world. The Romans were so mad at Antiochus III that having defeated him as part of the conditions of peace, they forced him to sign a treaty agreeing to pay Rome 15,000 talents within a 12-year period. Just a vast amount of money, and he didn't have that kind of money. And now he's attacked Asia Minor and Greece, and Rome's defeated him, and now this great tax is levied against the king of the north. That's up here, that's the Syrians. Verse 19. Then shall he turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Paraphrase, Antiochus III returns home and is faced with the task of raising money to pay the taxes. He makes an expedition into Susiana, that's over in Persia, to plunder a wealthy temple of Baal. While he was there, he was surprised in an attack by local residents and lost his life in 187 BC. So here he is trying to raid temples and rob them and other countries trying to pay these taxes to Rome, these 15,000 talents. And he got ambushed and killed in the process. Now that's going to throw the reign of Syria wide open. And now what's going to happen is a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Friends, he is the little horn on this Syrian horn of Greece here. When Alexander's kingdom divided, and Syria was one of these kingdoms, out of that was going to come a little horn, a fierce king. This will be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now a lot of people make this the Antichrist, and some make it Russia, and all kinds of things. There's all kinds of theories about this. I'll talk to you about that later. But for now, understand that this death now of Antiochus III has allowed Antiochus IV Epiphanes to come in with flatteries and through conniving steal the kingdom away from another man that was really the rightful heir. He stole the kingdom. He stole it. It would be like somebody stealing an election here in America, becoming president by having stolen it. And that's what he did in effect in his rule of Syria. But he doesn't care. Verse 20. Then shall stand up in his estate, this is the place of Antiochus III, a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. Paraphrase of verse 20. Upon the death of Antiochus III the Great, his son Seleucus IV, Philopator, a raiser of taxes, will begin to reign. He will send his prime minister Heliodorus to raise taxes. However, soon after this, Seleucus IV will be killed by Heliodorus. That's in 175 BC. Not out of anger or in battle, but out of greed and political expediency. So Antiochus III's son arises, and he appoints a fellow to raise taxes, and the fellow he appoints to raise taxes, Heliodorus, kills him and takes over. And now we've got another power vacuum created here in Syria. Verse 21, this is where we get to Antiochus Epiphanes. Now chapter 11, folks, changes. The king of the north now for the rest of chapter 11 on into 12 deals with this king of the north, this one man, this little horn that I told you about back in chapter 8, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he is a madman. He is a evil, wicked ruler. He hates the Jews. He persecuted and killed the Jews. He plundered that nation. He did despicable, horrible things to the people and killed so many of them. Daniel's being shown all of this. You could imagine his grief when he sees in his vision this evil tyrant that's coming that will massacre his people and loot his nation. And this is what Gabriel is showing him as he interprets this for Daniel. This is what we're to see and understand when we study now chapter 11 from verse 21 on through the chapter. Here it is, verse 21. The rise of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. He will be the king of the north now through the next, just the next many, many verses. Verse 21, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Paraphrase, verse 21. In the place of Seleucus IV, the abominable Antiochus IV Epiphanes will come to power. The legitimate heir, Demetrius I Soter, the son of Seleucus IV, will not receive the kingdom to which he's entitled, but Antiochus IV will obtain the kingdom by flattery and deception. Verse 22. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. Paraphrase. Antiochus IV Epiphanes will be successful in many battles, and he will even remove the high priest of the Jews, Onias III. He just removes him from power. That's coming against the prince of the covenant. That's the high priest. Okay? Verse 23. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Paraphrase on 23. Antiochus makes many leagues and agreements, but can never be trusted to keep his word. Although the Syrians do not have a large population, he becomes strong with a small people. Verse 24. Still talking about Antiochus. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Paraphrase. Antiochus will take those places that were peaceable and prosperous and do things that his forefathers have not done. He will divide the spoils and riches from his conquest among his soldiers and others. He also will have designs and plans for a time to take the strongholds of other countries that he wishes to add to his kingdom. Verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Paraphrase on verse 25. In 170 BC, Antiochus IV invades Egypt, which is ruled by his nephew, Ptolemy VI Philometor, and has great success against him. Although Ptolemy VI has a great army, he is defeated. Thus Antiochus IV takes many Egyptian cities and advances all the way to Memphis. Verse 26. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. Paraphrase. Verse 26, some who are aligned with Ptolemy VI will defect and support the armies of Antiochus IV. This will aid in the defeat of the Egyptian armies. Now verse 27. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Verse 27, paraphrase. Antiochus IV and his nephew Ptolemy VI Philometor will meet to discuss conditions of peace. This is in 169 BC. Antiochus IV will impose terms that would leave Ptolemy VI as king of Egypt, but in effect will make himself the real ruler in Egypt. The treaty looks as if it might work, but it didn't, because the terms of the treaty became known at Alexandria. Therefore, the Alexandrians reject Ptolemy VI Philometor as their king. Instead, they make his younger brother, Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II, later known as Ptolemy VIII Physcon, their king. When the army of Antiochus IV assaults Alexandria in the late summer of 169 BC, the Alexandrians will completely withstand the attack and repulse it. So Alexander tried taking Egypt completely in this battle against the city of Alexandria, and he lost. And he lost decisively. Now that's going to make him mad. And he's going to go back home to Syria through Palestine, and when he does, he'll stop in Jerusalem and take his anger out on the Jews. This is where Israel, lying in between Egypt and Syria, is just persecuted and tormented continually. Verse 28. Speaking of Antiochus IV now still. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Paraphrase of 28. Antiochus IV Epiphanes will leave Egypt with vast riches, but on the way home he will rob the temple at Jerusalem, 169 BC. After he plunders the temple, he will return to Syria. So he goes into the temple there, and he just begins to plunder everything. Anything that's gold or silver, whatever treasure he finds, he just steals it. Takes whatever he wants from the Jews, goes on back to Syria. Verse 29. And at the appointed time he shall return and come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Verse 29. At a future time, this is the paraphrase, at a future time, 168 BC, Antiochus IV will again attack Egypt. But he will not be as successful as his father, the former, or his last invasion, the latter. Verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Paraphrase of verse 30. For at the request of the Egyptians, Rome will send ships and an envoy to order Antiochus IV to leave Egypt. He will leave in humiliation and take his anger out upon the temple and the Jewish people. Many Hellenist Jews will conspire with him to oppose Orthodox Jews who still cling to the Holy Covenant. May I simply tell you here at this point, when Alexander up here in Syria, or Antiochus rather the fourth up here in Syria, comes down again to attack Egypt, the Egyptians have already anticipated that move, and they've made an appeal to Rome. Now Rome has an agreement. Rome will protect all of its allies, and Egypt at this time is an ally of Rome. And Rome is committed to protecting its allies. So when Alexander comes down here, Antiochus IV, and attacks Egypt, thinking to take it over this time, comes with a vast army. Rome has sent a convoy of ships. Some of them come off the coast of Asia Minor up here, and they converge down here at Egypt. And there's an emissary sent, and he's got a letter from the Roman Senate telling Antiochus IV to get out of Egypt, to get out or face the consequences. If he doesn't get out, Rome, he's going to have war with Rome. Now, he doesn't want war with Rome, believe me. And so Antiochus IV tells the Roman emissary, he says, I'll think about it. I'll give what you've said here some thought. I'll let you know what I decide. Here's what the Roman emissary did. Here's Antiochus IV. The emissary from Rome drew a circle around him in the dirt. And he told him, you make your mind up before you step out of this circle. That forced Antiochus IV right there to surrender, to just leave Egypt. They didn't give him any time to think about it. It was, you better comply right now before you leave this circle, because if you step out of this circle, war is on with Rome. We're going to get you. And so he did the wise thing. He pulled out and he left Egypt. Now he was humiliated and he's angry. And as he goes north back to Syria, he stops here at Jerusalem. And of course he deals misery to the Jewish people. Some of the Jews there joined with him. He took his anger out on the temple, took his anger out at that time on the Jewish people. Verse 31, arms shall stand on his part, talking about Antiochus IV. He shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, this is the temple, and take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Verse 31, here's the paraphrase now. See, Antiochus is mad. He's been humiliated down in Egypt, and he's on his way back to Syria. Verse 31, Antiochus IV will send soldiers, supported by Hellenist Jews, to pollute the temple and to stop the practice of daily sacrifice at the temple. They will also set up an idol altar, placing a statue of Olympus Zeus upon it, and offer pig's flesh in sacrifice, right there on the altar. In addition, they will splatter pig broth throughout the house of God. They just splattered the blood and guts of pigs all on the temple and just polluted it. So they stopped the daily sacrifice. Friends, this was in 167 BC, and they set up that altar on December the 15th that year. 10 days later, on December the 25th, 167 BC, they offered sacrifice in the Jewish temple to the statue of Zeus and spread pig broth all over the temple. They stopped this daily sacrifice for a time of 3 years. For 3 years, the Jews never offered a sacrifice. Ultimately, under the Maccabees, this revolt that I've been reading to you about from the book of Maccabees, like last week, the Maccabean revolt, the Jews revolted under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. And finally, they threw off the yoke of Antiochus IV, and they took Jerusalem back and they took their temple. They rebuilt the furniture in that temple that Antiochus had stolen. They rebuilt the golden candlestick, the altar of incense, the table of showbread. They built a whole new altar out of whole stones. They cleansed that temple and set everything up. And 3 years to the day, in 164 BC, on December 25th, the very day they offered sacrifice to that idol, the Jews offered sacrifice again to God and rededicated their temple. It's called the Feast of Dedication, Feast of Lights. This occurred what would be our Christmas Day, although Christmas didn't even exist then, 164 BC. For 3 years to the day, no sacrifices were offered on that idol. It lay polluted, with sacrifices of pigs offered to a statue of Zeus. And so this is what's being told to Daniel here as Gabriel interprets this vision, okay? Verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Paraphrase of verse 32. Antiochus IV will further corrupt many of the Hellenistic Jews and persuade them to embrace even greater depths of wickedness. But many Jews will be strong, remain loyal to God, and have some measure of military success. That's the Maccabean revolt right there. See? Verse 33. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame and by captivity and by spoil many days. Paraphrase of 33. The Jews who both understand and have a zeal for the law will instruct many, yet many of them will be persecuted and even killed during this time of persecution. Verse 34. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Verse 34, paraphrase. In spite of persecution and death, these zealous Jews will receive help from men like Judas Maccabeus. But other Jews will only pretend to be supportive in order to spy for the enemy. Verse 35. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Now here's the paraphrase on 35. The persecution and death of those who have understanding will ultimately be of eternal benefit. It will purge and make them white, but they will have to suffer and die until God crushes the Seleucid Empire. However, it will be a while before the Lord defeats their enemies. Now, friends, there's the first 35 verses that we've covered. There's you a paraphrase of those verses. As best I can, it's just history. As best I can, I hope that I've made that a little bit more clear for you. Just remember again that we're dealing with a conflict between Syria to the north, Egypt to the south, with the Jews lying in between these two nations that are in conflict, and they suffer because of where they're located, because their nation is the traveling point through which both these armies must travel. And of course, they are controlled either at times by the Syrians or by the Egyptians. And so this is what Daniel's being shown, and this is what's in chapter 11. As I told you, the king of the north changes kings, so does the king of the south, until at least we get to verse 21, and then the king of the north remains uniform with this villain named Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. Daniel's being given all of this history. It's a gross history, very gruesome for his people. And now that brings us to verse 36, and it brings us to a controversy that unfortunately I may not have time tonight to unravel for you, but I'm going to tell you about it. And this may cause us to have at least 2 more lessons left in this series, but we're going to take our time and do this right. I'm going to read now verses 36 to 45. This finishes out the vision here in chapter 11, and will take us on into the remainder of it in chapter 12. Verse 36 to 45. Now this is still, to me, talking about Antiochus IV. It doesn't change. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. And thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now, before we proceed with commentary on these verses I've just read, and this will take me next week now, but let me set it up for you tonight, what we'll deal with next week. Before we proceed with the commentary on verses 36 to 45 and finish out chapter 11, there is a controversy regarding the king here in verse 36. Verse 36 just simply says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. And the king shall do according to his will." We just read about a king here. While it's true that these words, the king, still refer to the king of the north, the Syrians, several different positions are taken as to the identity of this king. There are 5 prominent positions that I'm going to talk to you about next week, and they are as follows. Number 1, there are some who believe the king in verse 36 switches now to Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the king that tried to kill all the babies, or did kill the babies around Bethlehem, trying to kill Jesus when he was a baby. So many believe the king here switches to Herod the Great. Some say that this king in verse 36 is the future Antichrist. See, they've got an Antichrist theory, and they try to get the Antichrist out of this king right here in verse 36. Still others, premillennialists, say that this king here in verse 36 is Russia, and they try to bring verse 36 now over to our day and age, and make the king there in verse 36 Russia, the king of the north. Another argues that the king of the north is Rome, that the Roman Empire has to be brought into play here because they also were an enemy to the Jews. And so that theory is advanced. And then there is the theory that I hold in favor, and that is that this king here that's mentioned does not change, that it's still Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. I don't see any change. Next week, as thorough as I can be, and yet as briefly as I can make it, I want to make a few observations on each one of these 5 different views. Herod, an Antichrist, Russia, Rome, or Antiochus IV. And I'm giving you these controversies here because you're going to run into this. And I want you to have some degree of understanding that there are just different views beginning at verse 36. If I were to just merely give you the commentary and not mention some of the controversy, and you were to run into that later, it might be rather confusing. And I figure it's a lot better to just tell you there's a raging controversy that switches here at verse 36, and we may as well deal with it before we move on to make a commentary on verses 36 to 45. Lord willing, we'll do that next week. I had hoped to get further tonight than what we've been able to do. It's okay. I don't suppose we're in a hurry. And next week we will break these 5 different views down and talk about them. I'll set this up again briefly for you. I hope that the information we've given you tonight now has given you, well, quite a bit more clarification on the first 35 verses. Because we've come at you, Ben and I have, with so much information. And we don't expect you to remember all this material at all. But what he and I are doing is we're getting this up on the internet, up on the website, where you'll have this as a resource. And so if you're studying Daniel 11 and you begin to wonder what some of these verses mean, and you want to hear some discussion about it, you can go up on the website and pull up the different studies that we've made on chapter 11, and you can get this this paraphrase, this study tonight, and hear what we believe the verse is really talking about and get it broken down for you. So we hope that this material is going to be a good resource for people that need to do that in the future. As always, we're so grateful to have you tonight in our midst, and we're so glad to have this medium through which to study with you. We're thankful that there's still good interest in this study, and we appreciate very much a lot of the remarks that we're getting and remarks of how the study is helping people and giving them some insight finally into Daniel. We're glad that we're able to help. We thank you for joining with us. For those of you that will watch late, who cannot watch live tonight, we understand that, and we're certainly very grateful for you. For those of you that have studied with us tonight, or those that will study this later with us, remember these studies stay up on the website. You can watch them over and over again until the material is much more clear in your mind. And we hope that you'll take advantage of the fact that they'll be there on the web for you. If you want to watch them 3 or 4 times, you can. As we leave you tonight, we wish God's blessings upon you this week. May it be a wonderful week ahead for you, and may tonight's blessings from God flow very abundantly to you and your family. We wish you a very